Monsters are one of the most fascinating things to explore when it comes to legends because the kinds of monsters a culture fears can tell us a lot about the society being looked at as a whole. Going back to the early days of Homo sapiens, it made sense to fear the thing in the dark, the unknown entity that might be lurking in the bushes, because that caution could mean the difference between making it home safe or being eaten alive. Our ancestors had to fear lions, saber-toothed tigers, cave bears, and a whole lot more, and they didn't stand much of a chance against nature's apex predators. That fear stayed with us, even as we built structures to keep out the beasts and developed weapons that would eventually put us at the top of the food chain. While some of the fear is justified, a mountain lion could still maul you with very little effort after all, some of it has moved to creatures that dwell more in myth and legend than in fact. Creatures like Carcinos, the crab that fought the mythical Hercules and became a constellation in the night sky for its trouble. The legendary hippogriff, a half-eagle, half-horsed beast created by Italian poet Ludovico Ariosto. And the bugbear, a hobgoblin known to eat disobedient children, fill the pages of history books and gives form to some of the many fears that human beings have had over the millennia. But not all monsters have a solid footing in myth, and some have even proven over time to be based on real beings. The giant squid and whale shark are a couple that come to mind, with the former only being really discovered to be real in the middle of the 19th century, with the first photos of a living giant squid in the ocean not even being captured until 2004. Even on land, animals like gorillas, okapi, and the platypus were thought to be fake until a mountain of evidence was available to prove that they were actually real. And as we sit in the modern era, there are dozens, or perhaps I should say thousands, of creatures known as cryptids, animals that many speculate exist despite a lack of solid scientific evidence for their existence. And this last group, the cryptids, is the one that has fascinated me and many others the most, while also leading to some of the biggest hoaxes and misidentification cases of all time. Some of them have been born out of local legends going back centuries, while others are a little bit more modern. Welcome to Lost Legends, where we dive into long-forgotten tales of love, loss, and monsters. I'm Josh, and today we're going to be talking about 3 stories from my home state of Ohio involving monsters. First, we'll be heading up north to the small town of Defiance, where a man/wolf hybrid known as the Dogman brought terror to a small town in the summer of 1972. Next, we'll make our way south to the community of Loveland, home to the larger-than-life Frogmen that scared the pants off of a businessman in 1955 and a couple of police officers in the spring of '72. Finally, we're walking side by side with Ohio's version of Bigfoot, known as the Grassman. Sightings of this famous cryptid hit a high mark in the 1970s and continue even today, with several witnesses claiming to have seen the elusive creatures as recently as March of this year. So, pull up a chair, grab a drink, and join me as we search for 3 Ohio men that you need to avoid. It's July 25th, 1972, in the small town of Defiance, Ohio. Nearly all of the village's 16,000 residents are in bed sleeping, but a few lonely souls are working the graveyard shift at the old Norfolk and Western Railway yard on 5th Avenue. There are a few lights in the area, but they aren't really needed as the light of a nearly full moon is casting a dim glow over everything. Ted Davis, one of the rail workers, is in the middle of connecting an air hose between 2 train cars when something odd catches his eye. Not too far away, there's a pair of large, hairy feet that appear very out of place in the dark yard. Not sure what he is looking at from the weird angle, Ted straightens up to get a better look, only to find himself staring at a huge, half-man, half-dog-looking creature. It has enormous fangs in its mouth, and it's carrying a 2x4 of all things over its shoulder. At this point, Ted's frozen in a state of shock. No one really expects to see a monster standing over them. And when something that wild shows up, your fight or flight response typically kicks in to try to keep you from dying. It only took a second or two for Ted's instincts to recover from the brief pause, and he tried with all of his might to form a coherent sentence. The logical side of his brain was probably trying to call out what was likely a person in a suit for trespassing, but somehow that just doesn't seem like the right call in that kind of moment. After all, we've all seen the horror movie where the security guard or other worker sees what he thinks is a teen in a mask, only to be eaten as he tells the kid to get out. In this instance, however, the scolding seemed to work, and the beast turned tail and got out of there without any further incident. That wouldn't be the last sighting of the beast, however, as just a couple of nights later it would show up again in the weeds near the rail depot, before running off and apparently nearly being hit by a car. Now, the first report wasn't quite enough to make the news, though a police report of the incident was filed. It wasn't until the 3rd of August when the story would first hit the front page of the Toledo Blade, under the headline, "Werewolf Case in Defiance Not Viewed Lightly by Police." Apparently, they didn't want to cause a public panic or bring out any false sightings or copycats, so the police waited until a few people had reported the sightings to say anything publicly. At some point, there was supposedly an actual attack, where one railroad worker was struck by the beast with the 2x4 that it carried around, but from what I could tell, it sounds like that was more of a wounded pride incident than anything else. There's not really a lot to back that claim up, and it doesn't sound like anyone was seriously injured. In the end, the police and most of the community concluded that the whole affair was likely a prank, perpetrated by some bored local. But no one was ever officially arrested, and no one ever came forward publicly to claim responsibility for the attacks. This story in particular is an interesting one to me because it highlights how fear can make us react or overreact to situations. See, a couple of the main descriptors for the Dogman, or Wolfman as he's also known, were that he was big and super hairy. Witnesses described a man-like beast, 7 to 9 feet tall and covered in hair. The police acknowledged that some of the hair could have been a mask, but also noted that the man in question was likely pretty hairy on his own. Now, looking at the claim of height, that is one of the things that is the hardest to estimate for most people, especially when we're scared shitless. It's easy to imagine one of the railroad workers or the grocery store clerk who nearly hit the Wolfman with his car adding a foot or two to his height when retelling the story to police and friends. Not because they were lying, but because they actually thought he or it was 9 feet tall. In fact, the problem with estimating height while scared is such a big deal that convenience stores, at least here in the United States, typically have height markers next to their doors to help clerks estimate a suspect's height after they've been robbed. Pay attention the next time you go into a gas station to the sides of the doors while you're walking out, and you'll likely see these tools, though hopefully you'll actually never need to use them. Alright, so the first one was likely a hoax, just someone messing around and pranking people as if they were a mid-2010s YouTuber. But I'm sure that we'll find something juicy when we make our way south to Loveland, Ohio. On a dark night in 1955, a businessman named Robert Honeycutt was driving through the small town of Loveland, Ohio, when something odd caught his attention from the shadows near a bridge. Drawing closer, he could see 3 figures standing close together, using the night as cover for some kind of covert meeting. The figures were about 3 feet tall and wearing robes, and as he pulled his vehicle up to the bridge, he caught sight of one of their faces and had to do a double take. It looked like the guy had a face of a frog. As impossible as that seemed, things got even stranger as one of the creatures spotted Robert and proceeded to lift some kind of wand above its head. Before the stunned man could blink, a bright light emanated from the tip of the wand, and the 3 beings vanished before his eyes. Stunned and unsure of what he just saw, Robert put his foot on the gas and drove out of Loveland as fast as he could, determined to never speak of the incident again, as he knew that no one would believe him. But then, if he never spoke of it again, where in the world did this tale come from? To be honest, I have searched all over the place, and I have not been able to find any kind of conclusive origin for the story of Robert Honeycutt. His name and tale are all over the internet in relation to the Loveland Frogman, but there's nothing that I've been able to find pre-internet to source as an origin for it. It's a weird situation because everyone just kind of accepts the story as true with no question as to the actual source, and that kind of thing just drives me up the wall. I need a solid foundation for something to really get into it, and so far we aren't off to a very good start with the Loveland Frogman. Thankfully, there's more to go on in the form of a police-involved sighting in March of 1972 that was actually documented in a newspaper. Police officer Ray Shockey was driving through the dark streets of Loveland on a routine patrol when he spotted some kind of animal about 2 to 3 feet tall with dark green or blackish scaly skin. He didn't get a chance to get any closer than the cabin of his patrol car, though, as the thing skittered down the bank of a nearby river and into the water before he had the chance to get out. Just about everyone laughed at his story, and he probably spent some time questioning what he really saw because of that. But not even 2 weeks later, another officer, Mark Matthews, spotted the creature as well. Officer Matthews had a better chance to look at it and was even able to fire off 3 rounds at the thing, missing all 3, before it finally escaped his view. Now, Matthews would team up with Shockey to create a crude drawing of the creature, sending it to the curator of the Cincinnati Zoo, Bob Lotshaw, who said that he thought it resembled a large frog, and a legend was born. For the next 40 years, people would report sightings of the Loveland Frogman on a pretty regular basis, but it wasn't until 2016 that the whole story would gain a bigger audience, as a local news story about a boy and his girlfriend seeing the thing would go viral. Sam Jacobs would record what he said he originally assumed was a large frog in Lake Isabella, just south of Loveland. And though the video is difficult to make out, it does kind of look like a frog with eye shine. A recent visit to a local park where I got some really awesome photos of frogs for this video just reinforces my hunch that Sam's video is likely a frog in the pond, just really zoomed in. But as I wasn't there when the footage was taken, all I can give is my semi-non-expert opinion. But the reason that I even bring up that whole event is because shortly after the story popped off, former officer Mark Matthews reached out to a reporter at a local news station to come clean about the truth of what happened in 1972. Apparently, things mostly happened as originally reported, except that Mark didn't miss the creature when he fired those 3 rounds. The thing was killed fairly easily, and on closer inspection it turned out to be an extremely sick iguana that was missing its tail. The leading theory is that someone got it as a pet and set it free when they realized how big the thing was starting to get. The cold Ohio weather in March isn't ideal for iguanas, and while it is possible that it lasted a little longer than it should have by seeking shelter in a wastewater outlet from the nearby boot factory, it was only a matter of time before it died on its own. Officer Matthews basically put it out of its misery. He said that he and Shockey came up with the hoax as a way to have a little fun, and short of a story in the local paper, the prank didn't really seem to go anywhere or hurt anyone, so they never bothered to come clean. Now, some out there might find that a little disappointing, and may refuse to believe that the whole thing was just a harmless hoax. And I get it. It's a lot more fun to think that there is some magical 3-foot-tall frogman wandering the streets of a small town in Ohio than to think that a police officer could have a little fun. But this is where we introduce the idea of Occam's razor to the mix. Put simply, Occam's razor is a principle that states that the solution with the fewest leaps in logic is usually going to wind up being the right answer. There's a little more to it, but for our purposes, it basically means that if the options are that either a race of magical frogmen exists and have remained hidden and elusive for decades despite our best efforts to find them, or that a couple of guys thought it would be fun to pull a harmless prank that wound up being taken way too seriously when the internet came around, it's more likely that the latter rather than the former explanation is correct. That doesn't mean that there are no frogmen for sure, but as we discussed in the last video, we should make a habit of following the evidence to conclusions rather than trying to make the evidence fit the conclusion that we want. So far we're batting 0 for 2 with the cryptids, as one is a confessed hoax and the other is likely one. But the third and final monster we're looking at is going to be just a little bit tougher to shoot down. I don't think Bigfoot needs much of an introduction, as it is one of the most famous cryptids in the world. Sightings and stories of giant beasts that look like large, hairy men go back centuries and span several continents. There's the Yeti, the snowbound beast that roams the Himalayas, guarding the mountains from those who mean them harm. The skunk ape, the Floridian cousin of the Yeti, that probably gets mocked just as much as his human counterparts for all of the weird shit that goes on in Florida. And of course, there's the Sasquatch, known to lurk in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest hunting for beef jerky. All told, there's about 1 million other variations that we'll probably talk about if you all want to hear more cryptid stories. Something that you could probably let me know in the comment section down below. But for the moment, we're going to focus on the Ohio Grassman, because that is truly an insane case. For starters, the name Grassman didn't even come into existence until the 90s, when a Bigfoot research organization discovered some grass huts in the woods while investigating a sighting of Bigfoot. For some reason, they made the leap that those huts were made by Bigfoot, and many attempts have supposedly been made to recreate the structures by humans with no success. I'll be honest here, this just seems like a really shaky PR stunt by the Ohio Bigfoots. Big feet? To get some name recognition, and while I'm all for a good PR move, I'm not buying it. I can get behind big, hairy, ape-like men living secretly in the forests of the world, but building a solid grass hut is something a 10-year-old could do. I know because my brothers and I did it a time or two as kids just for fun. But let's set aside the issues of the name for a moment, because there have been a ton of sightings over the years in various parts of Ohio. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, it was a big time for the Grassman in Ohio. And the papers were having a field day with all of the witnesses to his/her escapades. The Caton family in Parrish Township, Ohio, reported several sightings in 1978, including one where a large creature sat atop their chicken coop and stared into their kitchen window. They were hanging out with 4 other people at the time, and everyone there seemed convinced that they had seen something. They wound up calling the police, and they even filed a report about the sighting, but nothing much really came from the incident. The officer who took the report was skeptical, but reported finding some hard-to-identify tracks in the yard, and he said that everyone in the home looked genuinely shaken. A couple of years later, in 1980, there was a rash of sightings in Union and Logan counties on the western side of the state. The first involved a farmer named Pat Poling, who spotted something coming out of the woods as he worked the fields on his farm late one evening in June. He wasn't exactly sure what the thing was, thinking at first that it was a bear, but as it stood up, he swore it was at least 7 feet tall. As it walked along the fence line, he aimed his tractor at it and started making his way closer to see if he could get a better view. When he was about 30 yards away, the thing turned toward him and made an odd gesture with his hands before taking off and leaving the area. Another witness, not too far away, came across the creature as she was driving home from work in the rain. Donna Riegler said that she spotted something that she thought at first was a dog lying on the road as she crossed some railroad tracks in a thunderstorm. As it stood up, though, she realized it was more like a man, and she described it as taking the same general stance as the one that Poling saw the creature make. She wound up turning around and booking it to a nearby neighbor's house, where she called her husband in a panic before finally calming down enough to finish her drive home. And since it's come up twice now, it's worth noting that the stance the creature took, according to the first 2 witnesses, was kind of like a shrug with its palms facing them, like it was asking, "What, are you looking at me?" Now, the third sighting in the area was another one in a field, when a man named Larry Ramey saw the beast walk out of the woods and come at the tractor that he was using to work the land. Now, at first, he thought it was one of his farmhands, but as it got a little closer, he realized it was more monstrous than friendly. He wasn't sure how he was going to handle the situation, but when another tractor came rolling toward the scene, the thing hightailed it back into the woods. Now, funnily enough, the same paper that reported those sightings did a follow-up with the Catons, who were still dealing with the beast from 1978, even 2 years later. At that point, it had become like a pet of sorts, though it was more of a nuisance than anything from the sound of it. By that time, they'd taken to calling it the Minerva Monster, and noted that it liked throwing pebbles at houses. Now, I'm not quite sure why it would do that, other than maybe to tell them to turn their music down or something, but that is apparently a thing that Bigfoots are known to do. As a way to placate the creature, the Catons had been leaving fresh fruits and vegetables outside at night. And from the sound of it, something was eating them as they were gone every morning. Now, I suppose that Bigfoot could have been taking them, but if I'm being honest, I'd be more inclined to think that a wily raccoon was behind the whole thing as a way to get an easy meal. Joking aside, all of these sightings were more or less harmless, and whatever the locals were seeing sounds like some kind of wild animal at a bare minimum. And speaking of bears, that is another possibility here, as most of the people who spotted the thing saw it from a distance and could have easily overestimated its height and weight. Black bears aren't overly common in Ohio, at least not in the past 50 years or so, but they are known to show up from time to time. That's not to say that a Bigfoot in Ohio isn't possible, and as a matter of fact, there have been several footprint casts and strange hair samples collected over the years. As to why the number of sightings has increased, especially in 1980, there was even a group that had an answer to that. A group calling themselves the Mammal Research Team was hot on the trail of any and all sightings of Bigfoot. And they speculated that the number of sightings in Ohio in 1980 was linked to a mass migration of the creatures from the Pacific Northwest following the eruption of Mount St. Helens in May of 1980. The MRT thought that Bigfoot groups were migrating to Tennessee where they could live in solitude. I will say that as cool as I find the idea of Bigfoot moving across the country thanks to a natural disaster, I find it really odd that they would pick Tennessee. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful state. I love the Great Smoky Mountains. But they could have just gone a little further north into Canada, which is just a hair closer to Washington than Tennessee is. And they even could have kept a pretty similar climate doing that. Maybe they had some relatives in the volunteer state, though, who invited them to come stay for a bit. Who knows? I will say here that while I do poke a lot of fun at Bigfoot, as well as other cryptids, I love the idea of some unknown creature wandering the woods of the world just trying to avoid contact with humans at all cost. I'd do the same thing if I could get away with it. But the sightings didn't stop in the 1980s and have flared up over the years, including a rash of sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature in Portage County, Ohio in early 2026. And that brings me to the important note in this tale, because while there have certainly been Bigfoot hoaxes and people outright making things up over the years, unlike the first two tales, this one can't be written off as a straight-up hoax. Based on the available evidence, it's doubtful that a Bigfoot-like creature is roaming the woods of Ohio or anywhere else for that matter. But it's also really hard to completely rule it out, because while there are loads of sightings and reports that can be chalked up to misidentification, hoaxes, or outright fabrications, there are also a lot of instances where people have seen and encountered things that don't easily fit into one of those boxes. And that's what makes Bigfoot so intriguing to me. Like the giant squid, gorillas, and others that I mentioned back at the beginning, it's possible that there is still some large hominid living in the forests of the world that we just haven't been able to properly document yet. Perhaps they don't need as big of a population as we're used to seeing to survive, And maybe they're mainly nocturnal herbivores that have managed to fly under the radar and avoid detection through some as yet unknown method. But there is something to keep in mind as well here when it comes to evidence, because people often will bend over backwards to attribute and accept every little tidbit that they can get their hands on as evidence of something they want to be true. If you want to believe in Bigfoot, then every story and odd photo or video becomes evidence backing up the thing that you're trying to prove. But science doesn't work like that. You can't start with a conclusion, like saying Bigfoot or the Frogman or Dogman exist, and then work your way back, accepting only those things that fit your conclusion and ignoring all else. That's how hoaxes like the Frogman wind up becoming legends instead of fun, good-natured jokes that they were meant to be. We live in an age where it's incredibly easy to fake footage and photos, and where everyone wants their moment in the sun. Looking at the Bigfoot sightings in Ohio from earlier this year, we have to apply Occam's razor and ask ourselves if it is more likely that a few people misidentified something, overestimating its size in a moment of panic, while others jumped on the train to say that they saw something that they didn't, or if an 8 to 10 foot tall, 300 plus pound man-like creature that has never been shown to exist was making its way across northern Ohio. Cryptids are a lot of fun to talk about and speculate on, but there's a reason that they fall under the category of cryptozoology and not zoology. They haven't been documented to exist yet, and the best thing we can do is take any claims about them with a healthy degree of skepticism, while keeping an open mind when actual evidence shows up. With that, I'm going to bring this episode of Lost Legends to a close. Over the next few months, I'll be exploring other historic events, including more monster stories and monster hoaxes, as well as tragic tales of love and loss, and everything from major disasters to smaller moments in individual lives, like we covered in the first video on the channel. If that sounds interesting to you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss new uploads, and like this video so that YouTube knows it was worth checking out. I'm aiming to release 1 to 2 videos a month, and you aren't going to want to miss what I've got planned for the coming months. I've also got a Patreon linked below for those who are interested in helping me continue to grow, while getting access to other projects I've got, bloopers and outtakes, and more. For now, I want to thank you all for watching, keep an eye out on the past, and I'll see you next time on Lost Legends.